Hello. I am glad you are here, settling in, letting your breath slow as the world around you grows quiet for the night. I am talking about World War I. Take a moment to get comfortable, to let the softness of the evening hold you, and allow your mind to drift gently as we begin a calm and continuous journey into the past. Now let us ease ourselves into the long unfolding of a story that began with a single moment, a single sound, a single spark that would eventually pull nations, empires, and millions of lives into the vast current of a world at war. It is difficult to say when a war truly begins, but for this story, the moment that historians often return to rests in the summer of the year 1914. The world then felt different from the world we know today, yet it was filled with familiar hopes, ambitions, rivalries, and anxieties. Europe was a continent of grand empires, each believing in its own importance, each watching the others with a mixture of pride, fear, and suspicion. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched across lands woven from many cultures. The Russian Empire lay immense and restless to the east. Germany, newly unified and confident, stood with industrial strength and military ambition. France carried memories of past humiliation and longed for restored glory. Britain balanced the seas with a vast empire of its own. Everywhere nations were making plans, drawing borders on maps, and dreaming of futures shaped by their own power. Amid all of this, the people of these lands lived their everyday lives. Farmers tilled their fields. Merchants opened their shops. Children played in the dusty streets of cities that had stood for centuries. The world felt stable enough to those who walked through it, but beneath that surface there were tensions, older than any one person, woven through diplomacy and distrust. The uneasy peace that existed in Europe depended on fragile understandings among leaders and governments, who often believed that strength and readiness for war were the only ways to avoid it. Into this world entered a man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a serious man with a stern face and a complicated reputation. He carried with him the weight of an empire and the duty of preserving its fragile unity. His marriage, a love match rather than a political alliance, softened the severity of his public image for some. Yet in the halls of his empire there were whispers that he might bring change, and not everyone agreed on whether that change would be good. On a warm June morning, he and his wife, Sophie, traveled to the city of Sarajevo, a place rich with history and home to a people whose lives and identities were shaped by centuries of cultural interweaving. Sarajevo was part of the empire Franz Ferdinand would one day inherit, and his presence there was both political and symbolic. The city was lively that day, full of anticipation and curiosity. Crowds gathered along the streets, cheering as the motorcade passed by. Yet in the same city, watching from the shadows and blending into the crowd, were young men who believed that violence was the only path toward independence for their people. Among them was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. He and his companions were nervous, inexperienced, and driven by a fervent nationalism. They carried pistols and small bombs, and in their minds they carried the belief that by removing the Archduke, they would ignite a struggle that would free their homeland. They could not imagine the scale of what would follow. That morning, as the Archduke's procession wound through the streets, one of the conspirators threw a bomb. It bounced off the vehicle and exploded beneath the next one, injuring several people but missing its intended target. The city erupted in confusion and the motorcade sped away. The Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded in the hospital, a decision made with compassion but heavy with consequences, for it placed him again on the streets that had already proven unsafe. Meanwhile, Princip stood discouraged and uncertain. His plan had failed, and he wandered through the city thinking that the opportunity had slipped away. Fate, however, can be strange. As the Archduke's driver attempted to navigate back through Sarajevo, he made a wrong turn onto a narrow street. Realizing the mistake, the car slowed to reverse. It came to a stop just a few steps from where Princip stood. In that brief and fateful moment, he drew his pistol. 2 shots rang out. The calm morning shattered. The Archduke and his wife were fatally wounded. The news travelled quickly. Within minutes, the city was pulsing with fear and shock. Within hours, the empire trembled. And within days, governments across Europe began to react, each interpreting the assassination through the lens of their alliances, ambitions, and long-held grievances. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for fostering the environment in which the assassins had grown. Serbia denied direct responsibility. Russia pledged support to Serbia. Germany pledged support to Austria-Hungary. France watched Russia. Britain watched Germany. The world, once seemingly stable, began to tilt. Yet in these early days, many still believed that diplomacy would prevail. Leaders exchanged telegrams, long and pleading messages filled with anxious attempts to hold back the tide. But the machinery of alliances had been built for decades, and now, once set in motion, it was difficult to stop. Mobilizations began. Trains filled with soldiers departed from stations across Europe. People gathered to cheer them, believing that the war would be brief and victorious. They could not imagine the long years of hardship that awaited them. And so, from that single moment in Sarajevo, the great conflict began to take shape, drawing millions into its immense gravity. But before we move further into the unfolding of the war, let us linger a little longer in the world, as it was before the storm fully erupted, to understand the atmosphere of the time and how the hopes and fears of entire nations led them toward a precipice none could truly foresee. Before the thunder of armies filled the air, there was a final fragile quiet in Europe. It was the quiet of uncertain days in July, a month suspended between peace and war, as diplomats wrote letters and delivered warnings, as newspapers printed rumors and speculations, and as ordinary families went about their days sensing that something immense was stirring but unable to name it. The people of Vienna, Berlin, Paris, London, and St. Petersburg read headlines with a mix of dread and fascination. Some believed the crisis would fade like others before it. Others felt in their bones that something irreversible was approaching. In Vienna, the leaders of Austria-Hungary gathered in ornate rooms, debating how to respond to the assassination of their heir. They were determined to make a forceful statement to Serbia, not only to punish those they believed responsible, but to assert the strength of their empire. To them, the assassination was not merely a tragedy, it was an insult to the dignity of their state, a challenge they felt compelled to answer. Yet even in their determination there was unease. They knew that any action against Serbia risked provoking Russia, whose pride and protective stance over Slavic nations was well understood. Germany, Austria-Hungary's closest ally, offered what became known as the blank check, a promise of full support no matter what course Austria-Hungary chose. This assurance emboldened Vienna, though not all German statesmen welcomed the path ahead. Behind closed doors, some worried that a localized conflict might spiral into something far greater. Still, they moved forward, believing that hesitation would show weakness. Serbia, on receiving the harsh ultimatum from Austria-Hungary, found itself in an impossible position. The demands were so sweeping that accepting them entirely would have meant yielding sovereignty. Yet Serbia knew that refusal meant war. Its leaders crafted a careful reply, accepting many terms but rejecting those that infringed most severely on its independence. Some believed that this measured response might ease tensions, but in Vienna it was dismissed as inadequate. The machinery of war creaked into motion. Across Europe, trains began to fill with soldiers called up from towns and villages. Many went eagerly, swept up by patriotic fervor and the belief that the conflict would be brief. Young men posed for photographs in their new uniforms. Crowds waved flags at stations, unaware that for countless families these would be the last moments they would ever see their sons, brothers, husbands, or fathers. Russia, bound by its cultural and political ties to Serbia, began to mobilize. Its vast empire moved slowly, the trains and lines of communication stretching across immense distances, but once mobilization began, it was difficult to reverse. Germany saw this as a direct threat and declared war on Russia. France, in alliance with Russia, prepared its own forces. One nation's decision influenced another's, and another's, until the entire structure of alliances, built over decades, pulled nearly every major European power into the growing conflict. Then, in early August, Germany enacted a plan long prepared, one that required passing through neutral Belgium to quickly strike France. The invasion of Belgium outraged Britain, which had pledged to protect Belgian neutrality. With the crossing of that border, Britain entered the war. The last threads of peace tore away. The world that had existed in June was gone. In its place was a new reality of vast armies marching, nations giving speeches promising victory, and people everywhere trying to understand what had happened and what was coming. Fields that had grown crops for generations would soon become battlefields. Rivers that had flowed quietly would become front lines. Cities that had known peace for centuries would hear artillery fire. Yet before the true brutality of trench warfare settled into place, there were early moments filled with the movement of armies across open landscapes. Soldiers who had left home believing the war would be a matter of swift maneuver, soon found that the enemy was stronger and more resilient than expected. The German advance through Belgium faced brave resistance. The French and British armies, though unprepared for the full scale of the German offensive, pushed forward with determination. In these early days, hope still lingered that the conflict might be decided quickly. Commanders on all sides dreamed of a decisive battle, a final dramatic clash that would determine the fate of nations. But the technology of war had changed faster than the strategies. Machine guns, heavy artillery, and rapid-fire rifles turned open fields into deadly traps. The old tactics of charging across ground toward enemy lines led only to staggering losses. As summer turned to autumn, the realization began to settle in. This war would not be swift. It would not be glorious. It would not be clean. It would stretch on, reshaping the world in ways no one had imagined. And so the great armies dug into the earth. Long trenches were carved across the countryside, from the North Sea all the way to the borders of Switzerland. In these trenches, countless soldiers would live, fight, and endure conditions that tested the limits of human resilience. Mud, cold, hunger, exhaustion, and constant danger became their daily companions. Above them, artillery shells traced arcs through the sky. Below them, the earth trembled with the impact of explosions. But before we move deeper into trench life and the years that followed, let us pause within this early moment of transition, when nations were still adjusting to the shock of the war they had entered, when the first battles were being fought and the first terrible losses were being counted, and when the people of Europe were beginning to understand that their world had changed forever. The trenches began as simple ditches carved into the soil by cold and frightened hands, but as days turned into weeks and the front refused to move, they expanded into an enormous system of living corridors. Soldiers dug deeper, fortified their walls with wooden planks, sandbags, and whatever materials they could find. What had begun as a temporary measure became a vast, interconnected world beneath the open sky. These trenches were not just lines in the earth. They were places where men ate, slept, prayed, and waited. They were places where the sounds of life and the sounds of death blended into one another in a way that changed soldiers forever. At dawn, a pale grey light would spread across the landscape, revealing a world scarred by shells and smoke. The earth was churned into thick mud, its surface broken by craters and fallen trees. In the distance, the shapes of barbed wire glistened faintly with dew. Beyond that wire, perhaps only a few hundred yards away, were the trenches of the opposing side. Sometimes soldiers could hear the quiet murmur of voices drifting across the no-man's land, reminding them that the men they were ordered to kill were young like them. wary like them, longing for home just as they did. Early in the war, commanders on all sides struggled to adapt to the new reality. They had imagined swift movements and decisive battles. Instead, they found themselves facing a stalemate. When troops attempted to charge across no man's land, they were met with withering fire. Artillery softened the ground before attacks, but even the most intense bombardments often failed to destroy well-dug defenses. The muddy soil absorbed the shock of explosions, leaving trenches intact. Machine guns mowed down entire waves of advancing soldiers. Every inch gained cost countless lives. Every attempt to break the stalemate only led to more suffering. As autumn deepened, rains turned the trenches into watery channels. Men stood for hours in cold water that reached their ankles, calves, even knees. Their boots grew heavy with mud. Some developed trench foot, a painful condition that could lead to amputation. Lice crawled through their clothing. Rats scurried along the trench walls, feeding on scraps, and, in the darkest moments, on the fallen bodies that could not be retrieved from no man's land. And yet, through all of this, soldiers found ways to endure. They shared stories, passed around letters from home, and formed bonds born of shared hardship. Meanwhile, far from the front lines, the leaders of Europe continued to speak of strategy, victory, and sacrifice. Governments reassured their citizens that the war would end soon, that one more push, one more offensive, would bring triumph. In grand halls and offices, plans were drawn on maps by men who could not smell the mud or hear the distant cries of artillery. The disconnect between those who ordered the war and those who fought it widened with each passing month. In Germany, the early momentum of the advance had slowed. The Schlieffen Plan, designed to encircle Paris quickly, had faltered. The Germans had expected the French to defend the border heavily and believed they could sweep through Belgium and northern France with speed. But Belgium resisted fiercely, slowing their progress. The French, with the support of British forces, counterattacked with unexpected determination. The First Battle of the Marne halted the German advance. In a remarkable moment, taxis from Paris carried troops to the front, a symbol of the desperate determination to defend the city, and so the line stabilized. The vision of a quick war vanished. In France, the bright colors of early uniforms became a dangerous liability. French soldiers had gone to war in red trousers and blue coats, traditional attire that made them tragically visible. As the months passed, uniforms shifted to muted tones better suited to the grim necessities of modern warfare. The reality of the trenches demanded it. Artillery shells fell without warning. Snipers watched for any sign of movement. To survive, a soldier had to become almost invisible. Britain, though initially possessing a smaller professional army, brought with it the strength of a vast empire. Volunteers filled recruitment offices in cities and towns across the country. Men from India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and other lands under British rule came forward to fight. They travelled great distances to serve in a conflict that they had not chosen but had been swept into by the tides of empire. Some fought proudly, believing in the cause. Others felt torn between loyalty and uncertainty, but all faced the same dangers when they reached the front. As winter settled over Europe, the war took on a slower, heavier rhythm. The cold seeped through layers of clothing. Snow fell on the trenches, muffling the sounds of battle. Fires were difficult to keep lit. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and passing around whatever small comforts they had received from home. It was during one of those early winters that something extraordinary happened. Along parts of the Western Front, soldiers on both sides began to sing carols on Christmas Eve. The melodies drifted across no man's land, soft and calming, carrying with them the memories of home. Slowly, cautiously, soldiers emerged from their trenches. They approached the barbed wire, unarmed, their breath visible in the cold air. Hands were extended. Small gifts were exchanged. Cigarettes, food, simple tokens of goodwill. For a few precious hours, the war paused. Men who just days before had fired at each other now spoke, laughed, and remembered their shared humanity. It was not a universal truce, but where it occurred, it left a mark on all who witnessed it. And then, as dawn broke, orders came. The truce ended. The war resumed. Beyond the Western Front, the war spread into other theaters. In Eastern Europe, Russia faced Germany and Austria-Hungary on vast, open plains. The scale was immense. Armies marched across distances far greater than those in the West. Battles were fluid, shifting, and brutal. In the early months, Russia mobilized faster than the Germans had expected, sending large forces into East Prussia. But the Russian armies were poorly coordinated, and at the Battle of Tannenberg, they suffered devastating losses. Entire units were encircled. Communications broke down. The defeat echoed across the empire, revealing weaknesses that would grow more severe as the war continued. Austria-Hungary struggled as well. Its armies faced difficulties on multiple fronts. In Serbia, what was expected to be a quick victory became a prolonged and costly campaign. The Serbian army, though smaller, fought with fierce determination. They knew the terrain, and they defended their homeland with every resource they had. The battles in the mountains and valleys were harsh, and disease swept through the armies, taking many lives. But Serbia held out far longer than anyone had predicted. As the war widened, new technologies emerged. Airplanes, once considered novelties, became tools of reconnaissance and eventually of combat. Early pilots flew in open cockpits, exposed to the elements, using handguns or rifles to shoot at enemy planes before machine guns were mounted on aircraft. These air battles were dangerous, chaotic, and unpredictable. Some pilots became famous for their daring feats. The skies over Europe became another battlefield. Submarines also played a growing role. Germany's use of U-boats threatened ships carrying supplies to Britain. The cold waters of the Atlantic became treacherous. Merchant vessels sailed with caution, aware that beneath the waves lurked unseen dangers. When passenger liners were targeted, outrage spread across the world, bringing new tensions and shifting opinions. On the home front, civilians bore the burden of a war they could not escape. Food shortages became common. Rationing was introduced. Women took on roles in factories, farms, and hospitals, doing work that had once been reserved almost entirely for men. They operated machinery, produced munitions, cared for the wounded, and kept the fabric of society intact, while millions of men fought at the front. Their contributions would have lasting effects, altering social norms and expectations long after the war ended. Yet even with all these changes, the front lines remained stubbornly unmoving. In places, the trenches were only a few dozen yards apart. Soldiers could hear each other talking. They could smell each other's cooking. At night, the sky flickered with the flashes of artillery fire. The ground shook. The air filled with smoke. And through it all, men waited. They waited for orders, for letters, for dawn, for quiet, for anything that might break the monotony or the fear. As the war entered its second year, attempts to break the stalemate grew more desperate. Commanders believed that overwhelming force might be enough to shatter the enemy lines. One such attempt occurred in the region of Champagne, where French forces launched a massive offensive. Artillery roared, waves of soldiers advanced, yet the German defenses held. Lives were lost by the thousands, and the front barely shifted. In Britain, new armies composed of volunteers trained rigorously. These were the men of the so-called PALS battalions, units formed of friends, neighbours, and co-workers. The idea had seemed noble at first, allowing men to serve alongside those they knew. But when these battalions went into battle, the losses could devastate entire communities. A single day's fighting might mean that hundreds of young men from the same town would never return. The grief that followed was overwhelming. As spring returned, the war expanded once more. In Gallipoli, a peninsula in the Ottoman Empire, Allied forces attempted to secure a route to Russia by attacking from the sea. The landings were difficult. The terrain was rugged. The Ottoman forces, led by determined commanders, defended fiercely. For months the fighting dragged on, with little progress and heavy casualties. Eventually the campaign was abandoned, leaving behind a legacy of sacrifice and sorrow, particularly felt by the soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, whose bravery became a defining memory for both nations. Back on the Western Front, new horrors awaited. The year 1915 saw the first large-scale use of poison gas. A cloud of greenish mist drifted toward enemy lines, carried by the wind. Soldiers who breathed it felt their lungs burn. Panic spread. Masks were rushed into production, but the fear of gas attacks never disappeared. It became another terror added to the growing list that soldiers had to endure. Throughout all of this, the people of Europe continued to hope for peace. There were moments when negotiations seemed possible, but each time they faltered. Pride, fear, ambition, and mistrust stood in the way. Leaders spoke of honor, of duty, of the need to continue until victory, and so the war dragged on. As we move deeper into the story, the months will turn into years, and the suffering will grow. Yet within that suffering there will also be courage, resilience, and moments of humanity that shine even in the darkest times. We return now to the middle of the war, to a world that had already endured months of strain and uncertainty, a world in which the hopes of a quick resolution had faded like mist under a rising sun. The trenches stretched on without end, their lines etched into the soil of Europe like deep scars. Every nation involved was beginning to understand that this conflict would demand more than anyone had imagined. It would test the patience, the endurance, and the spirit of entire populations. As the war entered its second full year, the landscape of the Western Front settled into a grim familiarity. Soldiers knew the routine of life at the front, long periods of waiting punctuated by sudden bursts of terror. They might spend days in relative quiet, repairing trench walls, cleaning equipment, writing letters, or simply staring out across no man's land. Then, without warning, an artillery barrage would begin, shaking the ground beneath their feet, showering them with dirt and debris, and forcing them to crouch low in whatever shelter they could find. In the midst of these daily hardships, camaraderie grew. Soldiers leaned on each other, sharing what little they had. They exchanged stories of home, spoke of loved ones, and dreamed of peaceful days. These bonds helped them survive the unrelenting pressures of life in the trenches. They gave meaning to the moments between battles. They reminded each other that they were more than mere cogs in the machinery of war. Yet even as life in the trenches settled into a rhythm, the war's scale continued to widen. Supplies had to be transported. Weapons had to be manufactured. Food had to be rationed. Entire factories restructured themselves to meet the demands of the conflict. The metal that once shaped plows and tools was now poured into artillery shells and rifles. The hands that once harvested crops now packed crates of ammunition. In cities and towns across Europe, women stepped into roles that had long been denied to them. They worked in munitions factories, their faces often dusted with yellow chemicals from the explosives they handled. They drove vehicles, operated heavy machinery, ran businesses, and managed farms. The world was changing around them, reshaping expectations and possibilities. They were not loud about their contributions, but quietly and steadily they kept entire nations functioning. Without their efforts, the armies at the front could not have been sustained. While the Western Front remained locked in stalemate, the Eastern Front saw more fluid but equally brutal warfare. Russia, immense and difficult to govern, faced enormous challenges. Its armies were vast, but they were plagued by shortages of equipment and poor coordination. Even when victories were achieved, they often came at staggering human cost. The Russian people grew wary, burdened by food shortages and rising unrest. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the spark that would ignite profound change. Austria-Hungary, too, struggled. The empire was a tapestry of many cultures and languages, and the strains of war pulled at its threads. Its armies suffered repeated setbacks. They fought on multiple fronts, stretched thin and facing determined enemies. The unity that held the empire together wavered. Yet still, the war went on. Far from Europe, other fronts continued to expand. The Ottoman Empire entered the war alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Middle East became a region of shifting alliances and battles. The deserts, with their vast horizons and harsh climates, offered no mercy. Soldiers who had grown up among rolling green fields now found themselves marching over sand dunes, enduring blistering heat and cold desert nights. The Ottoman forces faced both external enemies and internal challenges, but they fought with fierce determination. In the same regions, Arab revolts began to take shape. Leaders sought independence from the Ottomans, and British officers supported them, hoping to weaken Ottoman control. Among these officers was a young man who became known for his role in the desert campaigns. He traveled with Arab fighters, learned their language, and shared their hardships. Though his personal legend grew far beyond the truth, his presence symbolized the shifting allegiances and complexities of the war in the Middle East. As 1916 dawned, two of the most devastating battles of the war were about to unfold: Verdun and the Somme. These battles would come to define the horror and futility of trench warfare. They would consume hundreds of thousands of lives and leave landscapes so shattered that they seemed no longer part of the natural world. Verdun began first. It was chosen by German commanders as a point they believed France would defend at any cost. They hoped to bleed the French army dry by forcing them to hold ground that carried deep historical significance. The attack began with a massive artillery barrage, the likes of which the world had rarely seen. The noise was so constant and overwhelming that soldiers lost all sense of time. The earth shook for days. Forests were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages were crushed beneath falling shells. French forces rushed to defend Verdun. The road leading to the battlefield became known as the Sacred Route, a lifeline through which supplies and reinforcements traveled day and night. Trucks rumbled along it without pause, their drivers exhausted but resolute. The French soldiers who held the lines endured unimaginable suffering. They faced waves of attacks, gas assaults, and relentless bombardment. The trenches were churned into mud. Bodies lay where they fell, often unreachable. Yet the French held. They refused to surrender the city. Their determination became a symbol of national resilience. One commander famously told his men that they would not let Verdun fall, and although he did not promise victory, he promised that they would fight to the end. While Verdun raged, the British prepared to launch a massive offensive on the Somme. The goal was to relieve pressure on the French by drawing German forces away. For weeks, artillery pounded the German lines. British commanders believed that the bombardment would destroy the enemy defenses, making it possible for infantry to advance easily across no man's land. Soldiers were told that they would walk across the battlefield as though on a peaceful march. But when the attack began, reality shattered those expectations. The German defenses had survived. Their machine guns were intact. As the British troops advanced, they were cut down in staggering numbers. Entire lines were torn apart. The first day of the Battle of the Somme became one of the bloodiest in British military history. Yet the battle continued for months, turning the once green fields into a wasteland of mud, craters, and shattered trees. Small gains were made, but at enormous cost. As these battles unfolded, the war's psychological toll deepened. Soldiers suffered not only physical wounds but emotional ones as well. Some experienced shell shock, a condition poorly understood at the time. They trembled uncontrollably, struggled to speak, or became unresponsive. In earlier battles, they might have been judged harshly, but as the war went on, medical officers began to recognize the trauma caused by constant bombardment and fear. At sea, the conflict continued too. The German U-boats sank ships carrying vital supplies to Britain. The icy waters of the Atlantic claimed many lives. In response, Britain introduced convoys, grouping ships together and protecting them with naval escorts. It was a strategy that would later prove essential, but in these early years, the dangers remained high. In 1915, the sinking of a passenger liner by a U-boat had caused international outrage. Many civilians had lost their lives. Among them were citizens of a distant nation that had not yet entered the war, but was watching the conflict closely. That nation, the United States, remained neutral for a time, its people divided in their sympathies, yet events continued to pull it slowly toward involvement. In 1916, after repeated losses and rising tensions, the United States warned Germany that unrestricted submarine warfare would have consequences. For a while, Germany moderated its actions. But as the war dragged on, German leaders began to believe that only a renewed submarine campaign could break the stalemate. They made the decision to resume their attacks, even knowing the risk that it might bring new enemies into the war. As the months passed, Russia's internal struggles intensified. The long strain of war, combined with economic hardship and political dissatisfaction, pushed the empire toward unrest. Demonstrations grew, strikes spread. The people were hungry, exhausted, and disillusioned. The Tsar, isolated and poorly advised, failed to address the growing crisis. Eventually, the pressure became too great. A revolution erupted, forcing the Tsar to abdicate. A provisional government took power, promising reform and continuing the war, but it struggled to maintain order. Another revolution would follow, bringing new leaders who sought peace with Germany and an end to the country's involvement in the conflict. With Russia's withdrawal, Germany saw an opportunity. They moved troops from the Eastern Front to the West, bolstering their forces for a new offensive. But the war was no longer the same as it had been in its early years. The United States, after repeated provocations and the revelation of a secret communication in which Germany sought to form an alliance against it, finally entered the war in 1917. Its entry brought fresh troops, supplies, and a sense of renewed hope to the Allies. The arrival of American soldiers in Europe shifted the balance. They were enthusiastic, well supplied, and unscarred by years of trench warfare. Their presence bolstered the wary armies of France and Britain. Though they lacked combat experience at first, they learned quickly. Their involvement signaled to Germany that time was no longer on their side. As 1918 began, Germany launched a massive offensive, hoping to break the Allied lines before American forces arrived in full strength. The attacks were fierce and initially successful. The German armies pushed forward, capturing ground they had not held since the early days of the war. But their momentum could not be sustained. Their supply lines were stretched, their soldiers were exhausted, and the Allies, reinforced and determined, began to push back. Slowly, steadily, the tide turned. The Allied armies advanced. Villages and towns that had been under occupation for years were liberated. The people welcomed their arrival with tears and relief. The German army retreated, fighting bravely but unable to halt the advance. On the home front, Germany faced its own crisis. The long years of war had taken their toll. Food shortages were severe. Morale was low. The government struggled to maintain control. When the Allies broke through the defensive lines, German leaders realized that the war could not continue. Discussions for an armistice began. The terms were harsh, but Germany had little choice. On the 11th day of the 11th month, in the early morning hours, an agreement was reached. At 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent. The war was over. After 4 years of suffering, the world exhaled a long, heavy breath. But the end of fighting did not bring immediate peace. The world had been reshaped. Empires collapsed. Borders shifted. Millions had been killed. Millions more had been wounded. Families mourned losses that could never be mended. The survivors carried memories that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The war was called the war to end all wars, a phrase born of hope rather than certainty. In the years that followed, nations struggled to rebuild. Treaties were signed. New governments formed. Old grievances lingered. Yet amid all of this, people tried to return to ordinary life. They planted crops, rebuilt homes, opened shops, and once again filled the streets with the rhythms of daily existence. We return now to the moment just after the guns fell silent on that 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A stillness spread across the scarred fields, a stillness unlike anything that had been heard since the summer of 1914. Soldiers looked up from trenches and dugouts, listening to the quiet. For years, they had lived beneath the constant thunder of artillery, the crack of rifles, the shouts and cries of battle. Now, there was only the faint rustle of wind across broken ground. Some men wept, some laughed softly, some stood in silence, unable to grasp the reality that the fighting had finally ended. But although the guns were quiet, the world they had shaped remained wounded. Entire regions were devastated. Towns and villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Forests had been stripped bare by shellfire, leaving only jagged stumps. Rivers ran muddy with churned soil. The earth itself had absorbed so much metal, so much destruction, that farmers would later find shells buried in their fields for decades to come. In France and Belgium, people returned to homes that no longer existed. They sifted through broken timber and shattered stone, searching for anything that could be salvaged. In some places, only the outlines of former streets remained. Churches lay in ruins. Schools were gone. The familiar landmarks of childhood had vanished. Yet even amid the destruction, the will to rebuild flickered into life. Families set up makeshift shelters in cellars that had survived. They cleared debris. They helped one another, sharing tools, food, and whatever comfort they could offer. The end of war did not bring immediate relief, but it brought the possibility of renewal. In Germany, the end of fighting brought political upheaval. The long strain of war, combined with hunger and unrest, had weakened the government beyond repair. As the war reached its final weeks, the German people rose in protest. Workers went on strike. Soldiers refused to obey orders. A revolution swept through the country, toppling the monarchy. The emperor fled the nation. A new government formed, one that sought peace and hoped to guide the nation towards stability. But the burdens of defeat were heavy. Many struggled to accept what had happened. The sense of pride and identity that had once held the empire together seemed fragile and uncertain. Throughout Europe, millions of soldiers began the long journey home. Some walked along roads still marked by shell holes. Others traveled by train, passing through landscapes that felt both familiar and foreign. Their uniforms were worn. Their faces were lined with exhaustion. They had seen things that they could not easily speak of. When they stepped back into their towns and villages, they were greeted with relief, joy, and sometimes sorrow when families learned who would not be returning. For many soldiers, the return to civilian life was difficult. They had lived for years in a world defined by danger and discipline. The quiet rhythms of ordinary life felt distant and strange. It would take time for them to adjust, time for their minds and hearts to settle after the turmoil they had endured. In Britain, France, and other allied nations, celebrations erupted when the armistice was announced. Crowds filled the streets waving flags and singing. Bells rang. People embraced strangers, united by the overwhelming sense of release. Yet beneath the joy lay a quiet awareness of loss. Almost every family had been touched by the war. Names carved into memorials began to appear in towns across the continent, long lists that stood as stark reminders of the cost of the conflict. The dead were honored with ceremonies, wreaths, and moments of silence. Their absence was felt everywhere. Across the oceans, in the United States, the mood was a mixture of pride and sadness. American soldiers were returning from a war that had thrust their nation onto the world stage in a way it had never experienced before. Families welcomed them with open arms, grateful for their safe return, but conscious of the sacrifices they had made. The United States, having entered the war late, had not suffered the same level of devastation as Europe. Its landscape was intact, its economy was strong, but it too had been changed by the conflict, woven into the complex tapestry of international affairs from which it could not easily withdraw. Peace negotiations began in the grand halls of Paris, where representatives from the victorious nations gathered to shape the post-war world. The discussions were long, difficult, and often contentious. Everyone agreed that the war had been devastating and that measures must be taken to prevent another such catastrophe. But they disagreed on how to achieve this. Some leaders sought harsh penalties against Germany, believing that severe terms were necessary to ensure security. Others argued for more moderate measures, warning that humiliation and economic hardship could breed future resentment. The treaty that emerged, the Treaty of Versailles, imposed heavy reparations on Germany, redrew borders, limited the German military, and assigned responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies. While accepted by the German government under pressure, the treaty left deep bitterness among many German citizens. They felt unfairly blamed for a conflict that had involved complex alliances and actions by many nations. This resentment would simmer for years, influencing the political climate in ways that would later prove dangerous. At the same time, new nations emerged from the remnants of old empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, giving rise to countries that had long sought independence. The Ottoman Empire, weakened by the war and internal strain, faced partitioning of its territories. Maps were redrawn, borders shifted, and new governments attempted to establish stability in lands where many different cultures mingled. In Eastern Europe, the Russian Revolution had continued to reshape the region. A new government had taken power, promising sweeping changes and withdrawing the nation from the conflict. The civil war that followed plunged the country into further turmoil. The echoes of that upheaval spread beyond Russia's borders, raising questions about the future political landscape of the entire continent. As nations rebuilt, people reflected on the causes of the war. Scholars, writers, and ordinary citizens wondered how a single assassination, one moment in a city far from the major capitals of Europe, could have triggered such a vast and devastating conflict. They examined the alliances, rivalries, ambitions, and fears that had entangled the nations of Europe in a web so tight that once pulled, it could not be loosened. They studied the dangers of nationalism when it pushed people toward conflict rather than cooperation. They considered the impact of industrialization, which allowed weapons to be produced with unprecedented speed and power. And they questioned the decisions of leaders who had believed that war was still a matter of swift battles and glorious victories, not yet understanding the deadly realities of modern technology. Artists and writers captured the mood of the post-war world. Some expressed grief and disillusionment, painting scenes of desolate landscapes and broken soldiers. Others wrote poetry that echoed the sorrow and futility of war. Their works became part of a cultural shift, shaping how people remembered the conflict and how they understood its meaning. These expressions helped give voice to emotions that many felt but could not articulate themselves. Despite the devastation, there were also signs of resilience and hope. Families reunited. Children returned to school. Farmers planted new crops in fields that had seen battles. Slowly, the rhythms of life resumed. People sought joy in simple things: the warmth of the sun, the laughter of friends, the comfort of familiar routines. The desire to rebuild, to move forward, and to create a better world remained strong. In some places, memorials were erected where battles had been fought. At Verdun, at the Somme, at Ypres, and in countless smaller corners of Europe, monuments rose to honor the fallen. These places became sites of remembrance, where people came to reflect on the cost of war and to vow that such suffering should never happen again. The silence of these memorials contrasted sharply with the noise of battle that had once filled the air. Visitors stood among the rows of graves, reading names and imagining the lives behind them. As the years passed, the world continued to change. Technology advanced. Air travel became more common. Automobiles filled city streets. Radios carried news and music across borders. The memory of the war remained vivid, but new generations grew up, hearing stories from parents and grandparents about what they had endured. These stories became part of the collective memory of nations, shaping their identities and their understanding of the past. Governments sought ways to prevent future conflicts. The League of Nations was formed as an international organization aimed at resolving disputes through dialogue and cooperation rather than war. It was a hopeful endeavor built on the desire to avoid repeating the mistakes that had led to such devastation. Yet it faced challenges from the beginning. Some major powers did not join. Others were hesitant to commit fully. Still, it represented a step toward a more interconnected world, a recognition that peace required communication and compromise. In Germany, economic hardships worsened. Reparations imposed by the treaty strained the economy. Inflation soared. People carried baskets of money to purchase basic goods. The frustration and despair felt by many Germans created fertile ground for new political movements, some of which offered simple explanations for complex problems. These movements gained followers by promising national revival and placing blame on certain groups. The fragile peace established after the war was at risk of unraveling, but the world at large continued to move in cycles of recovery and change. Young people sought to define themselves in ways different from the older generation. Music, fashion, art, and literature evolved quickly. There was a sense of energy and creativity mixed with an awareness of the fragility of peace. The memories of the war influenced culture in ways both direct and subtle. As time went on, historians continued to study the causes and consequences of the conflict. They examined diplomatic archives, personal diaries, letters from soldiers, and government documents. They debated how much each nation had contributed to the escalation. They discussed whether the war had been inevitable or whether different decisions at key moments might have prevented it. Their work illuminated the complexity of history, showing that no single event or individual could fully explain such a vast tragedy. Families kept photographs of loved ones who had fought. Some placed medals in wooden boxes, stored carefully in drawers. Others kept faded letters tied with string. These personal objects held memories that stretched across generations. Children grew up hearing stories of bravery, loss, endurance, and longing. Grandparents spoke softly of friends who had not returned, of nights spent in trenches, of the strange stillness that followed the final ceasefire. In classrooms, teachers told the story of how one assassination had sparked a world war. Students listened, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with disbelief that such a massive conflict could have begun from a single act of violence. They learned about the fragile balance of alliances, the rise of nationalism, the arms race that had created stockpiles of weapons, and the miscalculations of leaders who believed that a short war would strengthen their nations. The lessons were clear: peace required vigilance, understanding, and a willingness to see beyond the borders of one's own nation. With each passing year, commemorations took place on the anniversary of the armistice. People gathered at memorials. They observed moments of silence. They laid wreaths of flowers, red poppies symbolizing remembrance. Veterans marched in parades, their steps slower now, their uniforms carefully pressed. Those who had lived through the war shared their memories while they still could, knowing that someday future generations would have to rely on written accounts alone. Yet the world did not remain free from conflict. As new tensions arose, people looked back on the Great War and wondered what lessons had truly been learned. Some argued that the harshness of the peace terms had sown seeds of future turmoil. Others believed that humanity had still not fully grasped the consequences of unchecked aggression and mistrust. And so, as the decades moved forward, the world carried both the scars of World War I and the hope that its sacrifices might guide nations toward a more peaceful future. The winter after the armistice settled across Europe with a kind of heavy quiet, a quiet that felt both peaceful and unsettling, because silence had become unfamiliar after so many years of artillery and shouting and movement. In villages that had once echoed with the sounds of marching boots, people now heard only the soft crunch of snow beneath the feet of those who were trying to rebuild their routines. Smoke rose from chimneys that had long been cold, and windows that had been boarded up were slowly uncovered so that homes could once again feel the warmth of daylight. The change was not immediate, for the shock of peace had a weight of its own, but slowly life began to regain its rhythm. Yet beneath this surface calm ran currents of uncertainty. The nations that had survived the struggle were no longer the same as they had been before the conflict began. Old certainties had shattered. The empires that once had towered over their regions with unshakable authority had fractured. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a vast patchwork of cultures and languages, was now dissolved. Austria became a small republic. Hungary underwent its own turmoil, swinging between different governments as it tried to find its footing. In the lands that had formerly been under imperial rule, new nations emerged with pride and apprehension. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others were born from centuries of suppressed aspirations. Their people felt hope, but also knew that borders drawn on paper could not instantly resolve the tensions of identity and belonging that had long simmered beneath the surface. In the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire had once ruled, similar transformations unfolded. Territories that had been under Ottoman control became mandates administered by foreign powers. New political arrangements took shape, reflecting the interests of distant countries rather than the lived realities of the people who inhabited those lands. The carving of borders created new dynamics that would echo long into the future. Though many welcomed the end of imperial rule, the uncertainty of foreign oversight brought its own worries, for it signaled that peace did not always mean autonomy. Back in Europe, France faced the monumental task of rebuilding. The northern regions, where some of the worst fighting had taken place, resembled great scars across the land. Entire communities had vanished beneath bombardment. Mines lay hidden beneath the surface of fields where children once played. The government organized efforts to clear unexploded shells, a slow and dangerous process that would continue for years. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair roads, bridges, and railways. Farmers returned to fields only to discover that the soil itself had been poisoned by chemicals released during battle. And yet, little by little, life returned. New houses rose from the ruins, schools reopened, fields produced crops again. The people carried forward with a quiet determination, their hope anchored in the belief that renewal was possible even after immense loss. In Britain, families welcomed home soldiers who had defended distant trenches and fought on foreign soil. The return of these men brought joy, but also challenges. Many bore physical injuries that required long periods of care. Others carried invisible wounds, memories that followed them through their days and haunted their nights. There was a growing recognition that the war had inflicted psychological damage as surely as physical harm. People spoke softly of the men who startled at sudden sounds, who struggled to sleep, who avoided crowds because they reminded them of the front. The term shell shock entered common language, capturing the idea that minds, as well as bodies, could be injured by trauma. American soldiers returned across the Atlantic to a nation that felt distant from the devastation in Europe, yet forever changed by its involvement. The experience of sending troops overseas had transformed American identity and reshaped its sense of global responsibility. While many wished to return to isolation from European affairs, others argued that the United States had entered a new era. The tension between those who wanted to step back and those who believed the nation should play a larger international role would influence the political conversations of the years that followed. Factories that had once produced weapons shifted their focus to making tools, machines, and household goods. Workers adjusted from the rapid pace of wartime production to peacetime industries. Women who had taken on jobs during the war found that their roles were changing again, sometimes expanding, sometimes being constrained as soldiers returned. Their contributions during the conflict had demonstrated their capability in new ways, and though not all societies were ready to acknowledge it fully, change had begun. Movements for greater rights and recognition grew stronger, drawing momentum from the roles women had carried out with steadfast commitment. In the artistic world, the war left a deep imprint. Painters captured images that reflected the grief, confusion, and transformation of their time. Some turned toward abstract forms to express emotions that could not be conveyed through realism. Others depicted the devastation of the front lines in stark detail, confronting viewers with the raw truth of conflict. Writers explored themes of disillusionment, questioning the ideals that had once driven nations to war. Their words resonated with readers who had seen how easily grand rhetoric could give way to unimaginable suffering. Music, too, adopted new tones. Composers experimented with unconventional harmonies, mirroring the fractured world around them. The haunting melodies of some post-war compositions seemed to echo the lingering sorrow of millions. At the same time, lighter styles emerged as people sought joyful escape. Jazz spread across continents, inviting listeners to dance and forget, at least for a moment, the heavy memories of recent years. The leaders of the major powers continued to negotiate the details of the peace settlements. Their task was overwhelming. They sought to create stability, yet the agreements they reached sometimes sowed the seeds of future discord. This was especially true in Germany, where the conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles had profound and lasting consequences. Economic strain deepened as reparations payments weighed heavily upon the nation. Factories struggled, businesses closed, the value of currency plummeted. People found themselves spending their entire day's earnings on a loaf of bread because inflation rose faster than wages. The middle class, once a stabilizing force in society, saw its savings erased almost overnight. Amid this chaos, political movements emerged that offered simple answers for complex problems. They pointed to scapegoats and promised a return to strength and national pride. Many people, desperate for relief and direction, listened. Ideas that would once have seemed extreme gained traction. Though the world did not yet realize it, the fragile peace was being undermined from within. Meanwhile, in France and Britain, the governments grappled with their own challenges. Soldiers needed pensions, land needed repairing, war debts had to be repaid, taxes rose, economic challenges loomed, and though victory had come, the cost was so high that many found it difficult to celebrate their triumph without reservation. In the countryside, farmers faced labor shortages and equipment shortages. The war had disrupted the production of seeds and tools. Many who might have worked the land had been lost to the conflict. Fields lay untended. Livestock numbers had dwindled. But farmers, like so many others, pressed forward. They adapted to new machines, experimented with new methods, and worked together to restore their livelihoods. In time, their efforts bore fruit, and the land once again produced the harvests that sustained their nations. The generation that had been children at the outbreak of the war grew into adulthood during this period of transformation. They had spent their childhoods hearing news of battles and losses, watching their families struggle with rationing and uncertainty. Now, as young adults, they stepped into a world trying to rebuild itself. They carried with them both the memories of what had been lost and the determination to create something new. Their perspectives differed from those of their parents, shaped by a war that had revealed the fragility of seemingly stable systems. The question of how one assassination had ignited such a catastrophe continued to occupy the minds of historians and thinkers. They examined how the intricate network of alliances had created a situation where the actions of one group could lead to responses from multiple nations. They looked at the rise of militarism, the belief that national strength depended on a powerful army and navy. They explored how nationalist sentiments had inflamed tensions, pushing ethnic groups to seek independence or dominance. They noted how imperial ambitions had led to competition among great powers, each seeking resources and influence. And they studied the miscommunications, assumptions, and decisions made in the days and weeks after the assassination that had transformed a regional conflict into a global war. People across the continent sought meaning in what they had endured. Religious leaders spoke of suffering and redemption. Philosophers examined the nature of human conflict. Ordinary people, in conversations with family and friends, tried to make sense of events that had reshaped their lives. Some found answers. Many did not. And yet life moved forward, carrying everyone with it, step by gentle step. As the years passed, the wounds of the war slowly healed, though scars remained. New treaties were signed, new governments formed, new children born. Europe entered a period that would later be remembered for both its vibrancy and its vulnerability. It was a time of innovation, of cultural blossoming, of economic progress, but also of underlying tensions that had not been fully resolved. Still, in those years immediately after the war, most people believed deeply in the possibility of a peaceful future. They hoped that their suffering had not been in vain, that the loss of millions of lives would serve as a lesson powerful enough to prevent another global conflict. They clung to the belief that diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual understanding could guide the world towards stability. Yet history has a way of revealing truths gradually, and the path to lasting peace is rarely as straightforward as people wish. In the quiet towns and bustling cities of Europe, the future was unfolding one day at a time, shaped by decisions made in quiet offices, in parliament halls, and in the hearts of ordinary people. In the years that followed the armistice, the people of Europe found themselves living in a world where the ground seemed constantly shifting beneath their feet. The war had not merely damaged buildings and fields, it had reshaped identities, expectations, and beliefs. Those who had once trusted the stability of empires now found that the old pillars of authority had crumbled. Those who had believed that progress was a natural and unstoppable force discovered that human conflict could tear apart the very structures that society depended on. And so life in the post-war world unfolded with a mixture of hope and apprehension, as if everyone sensed that they were standing at the edge of something new, but no one yet knew what that something would be. In cities like Berlin and Vienna, one could walk down a street and see physical reminders of the past meeting signs of the future. A soldier missing a leg leaned on a crutch near a cafe where young men discussed new political ideas. A horse-drawn wagon creaked slowly past a shop window, displaying the newest mechanical inventions. A woman who had spent the war working in a factory passed a man who struggled to adapt now that his old job had changed entirely. Every person carried their own memories of the war, and those memories influenced how they saw the world that was emerging. In Germany, the political landscape remained turbulent. The new republic struggled to maintain stability while meeting the demands of the Treaty of Versailles. Government officials tried to balance their obligations with the desperate needs of their citizens. But every decision seemed to spark debate. Some argued that the treaty should be rewritten, that the reparations were too heavy a burden for a nation already reeling from defeat. Others insisted that fulfilling the treaty's terms was the only way to rebuild trust with other nations. Protests erupted. Parliaments argued. Leaders rose and fell. And beneath it all, the economy strained under pressures it could not bear. Inflation grew worse. Money lost value so quickly that prices changed from hour to hour. People went to market with wheelbarrows full of banknotes only to find that prices had risen again. Children who once spent coins on sweets now played with worthless piles of paper bills. because they were cheaper than toys. Families who had saved for years saw their savings evaporate almost overnight, dissolving into thin air. This economic instability unsettled everyone, for it was more than an inconvenience. It represented the erosion of trust in the very structure of everyday life. But even amid hardship, people adapted. They bartered. They traded goods instead of relying on unreliable currency. They helped neighbors with repairs, shared food, and opened their homes to family members who had lost theirs. These quiet acts of cooperation wove unseen threads that held communities together during times of uncertainty. They served as reminders that even when nations struggled, individuals could still show resilience and compassion. In France, the reconstruction of the devastated northern regions continued steadily. New towns rose where old ones had been reduced to rubble. Architects and planners debated how best to rebuild, whether to restore old structures or create entirely new designs. Some villages were rebuilt exactly where they had once stood, with buildings echoing the traditional styles that had provided comfort for generations. Others were redesigned with modern touches, reflecting the idea that a new beginning deserved a new appearance. As homes were reconstructed, families returned from temporary shelters to the land their ancestors had known. The familiar smell of the earth, the sight of a sunrise over a newly planted field, the laughter of children running along freshly repaired roads. All of these small moments helped to ease the weight of the past. In Britain, the sense of loss remained profound, but so did the determination to honor those who had fallen. Memorials rose in towns and cities across the country, each bearing the names of local men who had never returned. People gathered at these memorials to reflect not only on the sacrifices made, but on the fragile nature of peace. These ceremonies became part of the national identity, shaping how the war was remembered by future generations. And in quiet moments at home, families opened letters written by sons who had fallen, running their fingers over words that had traveled across the world before returning as a final message. Across the Atlantic, the United States experienced the aftermath of the war in ways that were both subtle and profound. The nation had emerged as a global power, yet many Americans wished to withdraw from European entanglements. Debates over the country's future role stirred conversations in Congress, newspapers, and dinner tables. Some believed that the United States had a responsibility to help maintain peace through international cooperation. Others felt that involvement in distant conflicts threatened the nation's independence and well-being. These debates reflected a broader question that many countries faced: how could the world work together to prevent another conflict of such scale, and what role should each nation play in that effort? In the cultural centers of Europe, the war's influence shaped art, literature, and philosophy in lasting ways. Writers captured the complexities of the human experience in stories that explored grief, love, and the search for meaning. Artists experimented with new forms that challenged traditional ideas about beauty and representation. Philosophers questioned long-held assumptions about the nature of progress and the relationship between individuals and society. The war had exposed the vulnerabilities of modern civilization, and creative minds sought new ways to express what they had witnessed and understood. And yet, despite the sorrow that lingered in the hearts of many, there were moments of brightness. Festivals returned, music filled concert halls. Families gathered to celebrate holidays that had been overshadowed by conflict. Children grew up playing games in the same streets where soldiers had once marched, unaware of the memories those streets held. Life moved forward not because people forgot, but because they learned to carry their memories with them while still embracing the possibilities of the present. Diplomats and leaders continued to meet, discussing how best to maintain peace. The League of Nations, though imperfect and struggling with limited authority, offered a place where nations could speak rather than fight. Delegates from across the world filled its halls with speeches and proposals. Some believed the League would usher in a new era of cooperation. Others doubted its ability to address the complexities of international conflict. But the very existence of such a forum reflected a desire, however fragile, to find better ways of resolving disputes. For many people, the lingering question remained, how had it all begun? How had the assassination of one archduke in a city far from the capitals of Europe set off a chain of events that would engulf the world? As historians delved into this question, they uncovered layers of underlying tension that had existed long before the shots were fired in Sarajevo. They saw how alliances intended to preserve peace had instead created an environment where one spark could ignite a global conflict. They noted how national pride, military planning, political ambition, and fear had woven together into a dense net that caught all of Europe when the first thread was pulled. Families who had lived through the war listened to these explanations with mixed feelings. Some found comfort in understanding the broader circumstances that had shaped their lives. Others felt frustrated, believing that no amount of analysis could make sense of the losses they had endured. But in homes across the continent, people continued to share their own stories, passing them down through generations so that the memories of the past would not be forgotten. In rural areas, where the rhythms of life moved with the seasons, farmers continued to rebuild their fields. They knew that the soil held reminders of the war, fragments of metal, rusted pieces of equipment, and the occasional unexploded shell. Yet they worked patiently, turning the earth year after year, planting seeds that would feed their communities. The cycle of planting and harvest provided a sense of continuity that helped to heal the wounds left by the conflict. In cities, industry gained momentum. Technology advanced rapidly, transforming transportation, communication, and daily life. Automobiles became more common. Telephones connected distant places with increasing ease. Radios brought music and news into homes, shrinking the distance between people in ways that had once been unimaginable. These advancements created a sense of excitement, as if humanity was stepping into a new era filled with promise. But even as society moved forward, shadows from the war lingered. Veterans gathered in small groups, sharing memories that they rarely discussed outside those circles. They spoke of trenches filled with mud, of nights illuminated by the sights and sounds of artillery, of friendships formed and lost in the chaos of battle. These conversations helped to ease the weight they carried, for they knew that only those who had been there could truly understand. And the world listened to them, slowly shaping its collective understanding of what the war had meant. Writers recorded their stories. Historians analyzed their experiences. Families held onto their letters and photographs. Each memory became part of a tapestry that stretched across nations and generations. As the 20th century moved forward, the long shadow of World War I reached far into the future, influencing politics, culture, and international relations in ways that would take decades to fully comprehend. Yet at the same time, the world continued to change, adapting to new realities, exploring new ideas, and searching for ways to prevent such devastation from ever happening again. The years following the armistice were not marked by the roar of guns or the march of soldiers, but by the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding a continent scarred by 4 years of relentless conflict. Across Europe, the landscape was forever altered. The forests and fields of northern France, Belgium, and the Western Front bore the deep scars of artillery fire. Trenches had been filled in, but their impressions lingered in the soil. Craters, some still half, filled with rainwater, reminded everyone that the ground had once been a theater of unimaginable suffering. Villages that had once thrived were reduced to piles of rubble, their streets interrupted by shattered walls and broken roofs. The process of reconstructing these places was painstaking, requiring years of labor, ingenuity, and cooperation. In France, entire towns were essentially rebuilt from the ground up. Architects and urban planners had to balance the desire to restore historical aesthetics with the practical needs of a modern population. Streets were paved where mud had once rained, and new public buildings rose from foundations made of reinforced concrete, a modern touch reflecting the technological changes the war had accelerated. Yet among the new structures, families planted gardens, restored churches, and reopened schools. The sounds of children's laughter returned to streets that had been silent for years. Life resumed its rhythm, but always shadowed by the memory of what had been lost. Belgium, too, faced immense challenges. The country had endured invasions, occupations, and repeated battles, leaving its infrastructure in ruins. The port cities that had once thrived on trade were crippled. Factories lay in ruins. Agricultural fields were littered with debris and unexploded ordnance. Farmers, sometimes risking their lives, went out to clear their land and sow seeds. Villagers formed networks of mutual aid, sharing tools, food, and labor. It was through these small acts of resilience that communities survived and began to flourish again. Germany, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the shock of defeat with the economic and social crisis created by the Treaty of Versailles. Hyperinflation became a defining feature of everyday life. The value of money dropped precipitously. A loaf of bread could cost thousands of marks one day and millions the next. Families saw their savings disappear overnight, and basic necessities became luxuries. Shopkeepers adjusted prices hourly. Trying to keep up with the pace of currency devaluation, people learned to barter, trade, and improvise in order to survive. Amid these challenges, political unrest simmered. Workers protested, strikes erupted, and extremist movements began to attract followers by offering simple answers to complex problems. The social and economic pressures created fertile ground for ideologies that would later alter the course of history. In Britain, the post-war years brought a mixture of relief, mourning, and adjustment. Communities mourned the loss of nearly 1 million soldiers, while simultaneously celebrating the return of those who survived. Memorials were constructed in towns and cities, honoring the fallen and providing spaces for reflection. The war had accelerated social change. Women, who had taken on roles in factories, farms, and offices during the conflict, now faced a reconfiguration of their societal position. Some returned to domestic life, but others continued to pursue work outside the home, paving the way for broader participation in public and professional life. Across the Atlantic, the United States was adjusting to its own experience of the war. Though geographically distant from the devastation in Europe, American society had been profoundly affected. Soldiers returned home with stories of the front lines, leaving families to confront the reality that their sons, brothers, and fathers had witnessed suffering on a scale they could scarcely imagine. The country had gained recognition as a global power, but debates about isolationism and international involvement dominated political life. Economically, the US experienced growth, benefiting from wartime production and post-war reconstruction demands abroad. This period laid the foundations for a new era of American influence on the global stage. In Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Russian Empire continued to reverberate. The Bolshevik Revolution had ended Russia's involvement in the war, but it also plunged the nation into civil war, famine, and social upheaval. Millions were displaced, and the political landscape was entirely transformed. Borders were redrawn, new governments emerged, and revolutionary ideas spread throughout the region. People who had survived the horrors of the front lines now faced the equally terrifying uncertainty of civil conflict as ideologies competed for dominance in a world already exhausted by years of devastation. The Ottoman Empire, too, had disintegrated. Former territories were divided into mandates administered by Britain, France, and other powers, creating new political dynamics in the Middle East. Nations such as Iraq, Syria, and Palestine were carved from imperial holdings, often with little consideration for local populations. Borders were drawn on maps, but the realities on the ground, diverse communities with long histories and differing aspirations, made governance complicated. Promises made during wartime to local leaders often conflicted with the goals of foreign administrators, setting the stage for future tensions that would extend well into the next century. Culturally, the impact of the war was enormous. Literature, art, and music reflected both the trauma and the resilience of the era. Writers captured the sorrow, disillusionment, and absurdity of the conflict, portraying a world where old ideals of heroism seemed inadequate against the reality of modern industrial warfare. Artists experimented with abstraction and expressionism, using fractured forms and bold colors to convey emotions that words could not fully describe. Music shifted, blending traditional forms with jazz and other emerging styles, reflecting both innovation and the desire to escape the shadows of the past. In families across the continent, memory and storytelling played a crucial role. Survivors recounted their experiences to children and grandchildren, ensuring that the lessons of the war would not be forgotten. Letters, photographs, and personal belongings became treasured artifacts, serving as tangible reminders of sacrifice and resilience. These narratives were not always orderly or comforting, but they formed the backbone of collective memory, connecting generations to a past that had reshaped their societies. Governments, meanwhile, faced the complex task of navigating international relations in a world fundamentally changed by war. Treaties had attempted to establish peace, but disagreements over borders, reparations, and governance persisted. Diplomacy required constant attention as nations struggled to balance their interests with the need to maintain stability. The League of Nations, established with the ideal of promoting dialogue and cooperation, faced limitations in its authority, yet it represented an unprecedented attempt to prevent future global conflicts. Delegates debated policies, addressed disputes, and worked to create frameworks for collective security, even as political realities tested their ideals. Economic recovery was uneven. Some regions rebounded more quickly than others. Countries with access to raw materials and industrial infrastructure found opportunities to rebuild factories and stimulate growth. Agricultural regions had to recover from disrupted production and soil contamination. Cities faced housing shortages as displaced populations returned, creating pressures on infrastructure, sanitation, and public services. Despite these challenges, innovation and determination drove reconstruction, and the foundations for future economic expansion were gradually laid. Education also became a focus. Schools reopened with curricula that reflected new realities. Lessons included not only traditional subjects but also the history and consequences of the war. Teachers emphasized civic responsibility, the importance of peace, and the need to understand the global context in which nations interacted. Young people learned about the causes and effects of the conflict, preparing them to participate in a world that had been fundamentally altered. In the arts and sciences, technological advancements accelerated. Wartime innovations in medicine, engineering, and communications were adapted for civilian use. X-rays, surgical techniques, and medical logistics developed under the pressures of wartime treatment improved healthcare. Engineering advances supported infrastructure reconstruction. Communication systems, including telegraph and telephone networks, were expanded and refined. These developments reflected the dual nature of human creativity, the ability to destroy and the ability to rebuild. Psychologically, societies struggled with the scars of war. Veterans faced challenges reintegrating into civilian life. The concept of post-traumatic stress, though not fully understood at the time, affected millions. Shell shock, nightmares, and chronic fatigue were common among returning soldiers. Families tried to provide support, but the scale of trauma was enormous. Communities developed rituals of remembrance and support networks that helped individuals process grief and loss. These efforts, though imperfect, were vital in maintaining social cohesion. Politically, the interwar period was fraught with uncertainty. Revolutions, uprisings, and nationalist movements emerged in multiple countries. Governments sought to maintain control, often resorting to repression or compromise. The delicate balance of power in Europe required careful diplomacy, and the memory of the assassination that had ignited the war remained a cautionary tale. Small actions could have massive, unforeseen consequences. Leaders and citizens alike pondered the fragility of peace, seeking ways to prevent the repetition of catastrophic errors. And in the quiet towns, forests, and fields that had once been battlefields, life slowly reclaimed the land. Children played where soldiers had marched. Farmers cultivated soil still marked by craters. Streams and rivers that had been diverted or contaminated were restored to their natural flow. Nature itself began to heal, a silent witness to human endurance and the passage of time. Memory of the war became institutionalized in museums, archives, and memorials. Exhibitions displayed weapons, uniforms, and personal items from soldiers. Documents detailed battles, strategies, and political decisions. Visitors could see the scale of the conflict and the depth of human sacrifice. Education through these exhibits allowed future generations to understand not only the events, but the human experiences at the center of the war. Yet the underlying lessons were clear. Alliances that seemed protective could become traps, pride could inflame conflicts, and technological power, without moral restraint, could bring devastation on an unimaginable scale. Societies struggled to integrate these lessons into governance, culture, and daily life, shaping a cautious, reflective approach to international relations that was intended to prevent future catastrophe. Across the globe, the echoes of the war were felt. Trade, migration, and diplomacy were all reshaped. Economies adjusted to post-war realities. International organizations, though limited in power, attempted to mediate disputes. And though peace had returned to the battlefield, humanity remained acutely aware that the balance was fragile and that the choices of nations and individuals could once again have far-reaching consequences. The generations born after the war grew up in a world conscious of the fragility of human societies. They were taught that the assassination of one man could cascade into catastrophe, and that vigilance, empathy, and understanding were essential to maintaining peace. Their lives were framed by stories of heroism and loss, by memorials and ceremonies, by the tangible presence of war's scars in both cities and countrysides. The world, having survived a conflict sparked by a single act of violence, moved forward, always aware of the thin line between peace and chaos. And though it was a time of recovery, growth, and creativity, the shadow of the past remained, shaping every decision, every thought, and every hope for the future. After the first years of post-war reconstruction, the world continued to move through a complex and uncertain period, a time when the echoes of the conflict still shaped every corner of life. Cities rebuilt their streets, factories restarted their engines, and farmers coaxed new life from fields that had been scarred and abandoned. Yet beneath this visible recovery ran currents of tension and reflection, as people sought to understand not only what had happened, but how to prevent such devastation from ever occurring again. In France, the effort to heal from the war's devastation became both a practical and emotional task. The northern provinces, especially the regions around the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres, bore the deepest scars. Whole towns had been erased from maps. Churches, schools, and homes had been reduced to rubble. Reconstruction efforts involved both restoring the old and creating the new. Architects debated whether to replicate traditional styles or embrace modernity, and communities often chose a mixture of both. While reconstruction required immense labor and resources, it also offered a chance to heal the psychological wounds of citizens. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of battle gradually filled with laughter and the rhythm of daily life, a slow reassurance that life could return to some semblance of normality. The French people, however, carried with them a deep, lingering memory of loss. Almost every family had been touched by the war, whether through the death of loved ones, injury, or the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. Memorials were erected in nearly every town and village, serving as reminders of sacrifice and as spaces for reflection. The government also initiated national ceremonies, ensuring that remembrance became a cornerstone of collective identity. People observed these rituals with quiet reverence, understanding that honoring the past was as important as building a future. In Belgium, the process of recovery was particularly challenging. The country had been invaded, occupied, and fought over repeatedly. Its towns and cities had endured prolonged battles that left them in ruins. Factories, roads, and railways required complete rebuilding, while farmland had to be cleared of debris and unexploded ordnance. Villagers, often with limited resources, worked tirelessly to reclaim their land. Communities formed cooperative networks, helping one another with reconstruction and food production. The Belgian people demonstrated resilience, but the memory of occupation and conflict lingered, shaping their sense of national identity and their relationships with neighboring nations. Germany's post-war period was marked by profound instability. The Treaty of Versailles imposed severe reparations, military restrictions, and territorial losses. The economy struggled to cope with the enormous financial burdens, leading to hyperinflation in the early 1920s. Prices rose at an astonishing rate, often changing multiple times in a single day. Families saw their life savings vanish almost overnight, creating a sense of despair and frustration. Bread, once affordable, became a rare commodity. People adapted by bartering goods and relying on informal networks of support. Yet these measures could not fully alleviate the economic and social strain. The political climate in Germany was equally unstable. The Weimar Republic, established in the aftermath of the monarchy's collapse, faced constant challenges from both left and right-wing factions. Revolutionary movements, political assassinations, and street violence became common. Extremist ideologies gained traction, offering simple solutions to complex problems and blaming particular groups for the nation's difficulties. Many ordinary citizens, exhausted by years of hardship, turned toward these movements in hope of stability, security, and national pride. It was a period of profound uncertainty where the very foundations of democracy were fragile and vulnerable to manipulation. Britain, while victorious, also faced the challenges of reconstruction. The war had claimed the lives of nearly 1 million soldiers and left countless others physically and psychologically scarred. Families mourned their losses while welcoming the return of survivors who now needed support. Women, who had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the conflict, faced both opportunities and limitations. Some returned to domestic life, while others continued to pursue professional and civic engagement, gradually reshaping societal norms. Britain also faced the economic consequences of wartime spending and the need to rebuild both domestic industries and international trade networks. Across the Atlantic, the United States experienced both growth and reflection. The country had entered the war relatively late, but its involvement had accelerated its emergence as a global power. Soldiers returned to a nation largely untouched by the destruction that Europe had faced, yet profoundly aware of its new role in international affairs. Political debates centered on whether the United States should retreat into isolationism or embrace a more active global presence. Economically, the country benefited from post-war trade, industrial growth, and innovations stimulated by wartime technology. Socially, returning soldiers, as well as women and minorities who had contributed to the war effort, challenged existing norms and expanded the boundaries of participation in public and professional life. In Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Russian Empire had far-reaching consequences. The Bolshevik Revolution had ended Russia's participation in the war, but it had also ignited a civil war that reshaped the region. Millions were displaced, and entire economies were destabilized. Borders were redrawn, new governments emerged, and ideologies competed violently for dominance. The revolution's influence spread beyond Russia, inspiring political movements and unsettling neighboring nations. Populations endured famine, disease, and social upheaval, learning to adapt to a world in which the traditional structures of authority had been overturned. The Ottoman Empire's dissolution further complicated global politics. Former territories were placed under mandates administered by Britain and France, creating new political structures that often conflicted with the aspirations of local populations. Nations such as Iraq, Syria, and Palestine faced the dual challenge of asserting independence while adjusting to the oversight of foreign powers. Communities negotiated their identities and loyalties, seeking to reclaim self-determination even as the new geopolitical map constrained their options. The imposition of new borders and governance systems would resonate for generations, contributing to long-term regional tensions. Culturally, the war's impact was profound and lasting. Literature reflected both disillusionment and resilience, capturing the human experience of trauma, hope, and adaptation. Poets wrote of lost youth, shattered ideals, and the struggle to find meaning after widespread destruction. Artists experimented with abstraction, expressionism, and surrealism to convey emotions that realistic depictions could not fully express. Music incorporated both solemnity and innovation, reflecting both mourning and the desire for joy. These creative expressions helped societies process collective trauma and explore the evolving landscape of post-war identity. Education systems adapted as well. Schools reopened with curricula that incorporated lessons about the causes, events, and consequences of the war. Students learned not only history and geography, but also civic responsibility, ethics, and the importance of international cooperation. Teachers emphasized reflection, encouraging young people to consider the human costs of conflict and the value of dialogue and diplomacy. In doing so, they sought to prepare a generation capable of preventing future global catastrophes. Memorialization became an integral aspect of life in the post-war world. Monuments were erected on former battlefields, in city centers, and in villages across Europe. These memorials commemorated both the fallen and the collective endurance of communities. Citizens participated in ceremonies, laid wreaths, and observed moments of silence. These acts of remembrance were not only expressions of grief, but also tools for maintaining collective memory, ensuring that the sacrifices and lessons of the war remained central to national and cultural identities. Technology, spurred by wartime innovation, found new applications in peacetime. Advances in medicine, engineering, and communications transformed everyday life. Surgical techniques, developed under the pressures of battlefield conditions, improved civilian healthcare. Engineering solutions for transportation and infrastructure reconstruction accelerated economic recovery. Communications technologies, including telegraph and telephone networks, expanded, bringing people closer together and reshaping commerce, governance, and social interaction. These innovations were a reminder that even amid destruction, human creativity persisted, offering pathways to rebuild and improve society. Economically, nations faced uneven recovery. Countries with industrial bases and access to resources rebounded more quickly, while those that had been the sites of prolonged battles struggled with infrastructure damage and resource scarcity. Agriculture, particularly in areas affected by artillery and chemical warfare, required careful restoration. Urban centers faced housing shortages and demands for public services. Governments worked to stimulate growth, implement social support programs, and stabilize their economies, understanding that a sustainable recovery was essential for maintaining peace. Socially, communities struggled to reintegrate returning soldiers, manage displaced populations, and address the lingering psychological impacts of the war. Veterans organizations emerged, providing mutual support and advocating for benefits. Hospitals developed programs to treat both physical injuries and mental trauma. Families adapted to changes in social roles, particularly as women who had entered the workforce during the war sought to retain economic independence. These adjustments were gradual and complex, reflecting the multifaceted effects of a conflict that had transformed every aspect of society. Political landscapes were reshaped as well. Governments contended with unrest, the rise of new political movements, and the challenge of balancing domestic needs with international obligations. Extremist ideologies, fueled by economic hardship and national humiliation, began to gain support in several countries. Meanwhile, international diplomacy sought to manage disputes, enforce treaties, and create mechanisms for preventing future conflicts. The establishment of the League of Nations represented an ambitious attempt to promote dialogue and cooperation, though its effectiveness was limited by structural weaknesses and inconsistent participation. Memory of the war permeated every level of society. Families preserved letters, photographs, and personal artifacts. Oral histories were passed down through generations. Educational systems emphasized historical understanding. Monuments and museums provided tangible connections to the past. These acts of preservation were both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the notion that learning from history was essential for shaping a safer and more just future. As the 1920s progressed, the world oscillated between recovery and instability. Economies rebounded, technological innovation accelerated, and cultural life flourished. Yet political tensions simmered beneath the surface. The lessons of the war were not always fully internalized, and societies often struggled to reconcile the desire for peace with the realities of political ambition, national pride, and economic necessity. The post-war era, in this sense, was a fragile balance between hope and caution, renewal and remembrance, creativity and the lingering shadow of devastation. Europe's physical landscape healed slowly. Trees grew over shell-cratered fields. Rivers, once redirected or polluted by warfare, returned to their natural courses. Birds and wildlife gradually reclaimed forests that had been deforested by artillery and trench networks. In this way, the natural world quietly witnessed both human suffering and human resilience, providing continuity and perspective in a world forever altered by conflict. People, too, sought continuity. Rituals, festivals, and traditions were revived, adapted, or newly created to provide a sense of stability. Communities celebrated milestones, remembered losses, and nurtured hope for the future. Art, literature, and education reinforced the importance of both memory and progress, encouraging citizens to reflect on the past while actively participating in rebuilding the present. Through these efforts, societies gradually re-established a sense of rhythm and purpose. Daily life, though shadowed by memories of war, resumed its patterns. Markets, schools, places of worship, and public spaces regained activity. Children played, adults worked, and families rebuilt connections disrupted by years of conflict. The world moved forward, shaped by the knowledge that peace was both fragile and precious. And so, humanity emerged from the shadow of the Great War, forever aware of how a single act, a moment of violence in Sarajevo, had cascaded into a conflict that touched every corner of the globe. Lessons were learned slowly, sometimes painfully. Memory and innovation, grief and resilience, destruction and reconstruction all interwove into the fabric of a post-war world, shaping the generations that would carry these stories forward. The post-war years moved like a slow, measured river, carrying societies along a course that was both familiar and profoundly changed. Across Europe, the remnants of battlefields, bombed-out towns, and scarred landscapes served as constant reminders that human decisions, actions, and conflicts could have consequences far beyond immediate perception. The quiet that settled after the armistice was both a relief and a source of contemplation. People began to notice the subtle shifts in everyday life, the echoes of what had been lost, and the traces of endurance that had carried them forward. In France, the work of rebuilding was both physical and emotional. Families returned to villages that had been obliterated by shellfire. The reconstruction of homes, schools, and public buildings was a slow process, demanding labor, creativity, and patience. Streets once filled with the sounds of artillery now heard the rhythms of human life, children running, merchants calling out from market stalls, farmers transporting their harvests. Yet every corner retained the imprint of the past. Craters buried shells, and fragments of uniforms and weapons occasionally surfaced in fields, a tangible reminder that the land had endured unspeakable violence. The French people carried this dual consciousness, the necessity of moving forward and the weight of memory, into every aspect of their daily lives. Belgium's experience was no less harrowing. The country, having been occupied and fought over repeatedly, faced massive challenges in restoring its infrastructure, agriculture, and social cohesion. Cities had been leveled, factories destroyed, and farmland rendered dangerous by unexploded ordnance. Yet villagers worked patiently, clearing debris, tending fields, and reconstructing their homes. Networks of mutual aid emerged, reflecting both resilience and necessity. Communities realized that survival and reconstruction depended as much on cooperation as on government assistance. Over time, Belgium began to regain stability, its citizens balancing the grief of loss with the quiet satisfaction of restoration. In Germany, the post-war period was marked by turbulence on multiple levels. The Treaty of Versailles imposed punitive reparations, territorial losses, and strict military limitations. These conditions triggered economic crises, most dramatically manifested in the hyperinflation of the early 1920s. Prices escalated daily, sometimes hourly, eroding the value of savings and destabilizing social structures. Families struggled to afford basic necessities. People adapted through bartering, community support, and creative means of survival. But these measures could not fully mitigate the profound economic dislocation. The political landscape in Germany was similarly unstable. The Weimar Republic, born from the collapse of the monarchy, faced challenges from radical left and right-wing movements. Political violence, assassinations, and revolts became a frequent occurrence. Extremist ideologies gained traction, appealing to citizens desperate for stability, national pride, and answers to complex problems. Many Germans felt humiliated by the terms of the treaty and frustrated by economic collapse. The combination of resentment, uncertainty, and ambition created fertile ground for the radical political movements that would later reshape the country entirely. Britain's post-war reality blended mourning with gradual recovery. Families grieved the loss of nearly 1 million soldiers while celebrating the survival of others. Women who had entered the workforce during wartime found their roles shifting once again. Some returned to domestic life, but others pursued continued employment, influencing the gradual transformation of social norms. Economically, Britain faced reconstruction challenges, a shift in global trade patterns, and the management of war debts. Industrial centers worked to restart production, while communities adjusted to returning soldiers, infrastructure repair, and social change. In the United States, the war's impact manifested in subtle but profound ways. The nation had entered the conflict later than its European allies, but its involvement marked a turning point in international influence. Soldiers returned to a country largely untouched by physical devastation, but now conscious of its global responsibilities. Political debates raged between isolationists and internationalists, reflecting concerns about future entanglements. Economically, the US experienced growth fueled by wartime production and post-war reconstruction demands abroad. Socially, the war had accelerated movements for women's rights and broader participation in the workforce, setting the stage for transformative changes in society. Eastern Europe experienced the most dramatic shifts. The Russian Empire's collapse and the Bolshevik Revolution triggered civil war, famine, and mass displacement. Borders were redrawn, and new governments and ideologies struggled for dominance. Populations faced uncertainty, adjusting to a rapidly changing political landscape. Revolutionary ideas spread, inspiring movements and unsettling neighboring countries. The trauma of war compounded with political upheaval, creating a generation intimately acquainted with instability and resilience. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire similarly reshaped the Middle East. Former territories were placed under mandates controlled by Britain, France, and other powers, creating new political structures often at odds with local aspirations. Communities sought autonomy, yet were constrained by the mandates and the geopolitics of foreign oversight. The imposition of borders and governance structures set the stage for long-term regional tensions, reflecting the persistent consequences of decisions made during and after the war. Culturally, the war left deep and lasting imprints. Literature, art, and music became vehicles for processing collective trauma. Writers explored themes of loss, disillusionment, and the search for meaning, while artists experimented with abstraction, expressionism, and surrealism to convey experiences that words alone could not describe. Music reflected both solemn reflection and the desire for joy, balancing the acknowledgement of suffering with the persistence of life's rhythms. These cultural expressions offered solace, understanding, and connection, helping societies navigate the complex emotional landscape of post-war life. Education became a central tool for shaping post-war consciousness. Schools reopened with curricula incorporating history, ethics, and civic responsibility. Students learned about the causes and consequences of the war, the fragile nature of peace, and the importance of international cooperation. Teachers encouraged critical reflection, instilling in young people both the memory of human suffering and the hope that they could contribute to a more stable, peaceful future. Memorialization became a central feature of life in Europe. Monuments were erected across battlefields, city centers, and villages, commemorating both the fallen and the collective endurance of communities. Citizens participated in rituals of remembrance, laying wreaths, observing moments of silence, and recounting stories. Museums preserved artifacts, documents, and photographs, ensuring that the lessons of the war endured. These acts of remembrance shaped national identities, connecting personal grief with collective memory and providing a moral framework for understanding the costs of conflict. Technological advancements accelerated in the post-war period. Medical innovations developed during wartime improved civilian healthcare. Engineering techniques aided reconstruction and infrastructure development. Communication technologies, including telegraph, radio, and telephone networks, expanded, linking distant communities and facilitating trade, governance, and social interaction. These advances underscored a paradox of human progress. The same ingenuity that had enabled destruction could now support recovery, innovation, and connection. Economically, the world experienced uneven recovery. Industrialized nations rebounded more quickly, benefiting from technology and infrastructure. Agricultural regions struggled to restore productivity after years of warfare. Urban areas faced housing shortages, unemployment, and social dislocation. Governments implemented programs to stimulate growth, manage debts, and stabilize economies, recognizing that economic stability was a prerequisite for lasting peace. Socially, communities adapted to the post-war reality. Veterans reintegrated into civilian life with varying success, supported by organizations providing mutual aid and advocacy. Families adjusted to the changed roles of women who had demonstrated capability in traditionally male-dominated fields during the war. Displaced populations found refuge and employment in new communities, while broader society grappled with psychological trauma and the collective experience of loss. Politically, the interwar period remained fragile. Nations navigated the complex aftermath of war, balancing domestic stability with international obligations. Extremist ideologies gained traction, exploiting economic hardship and national humiliation. Diplomatic efforts sought to enforce treaties, mediate disputes, and create mechanisms for collective security. The League of Nations represented a hopeful but imperfect attempt at global cooperation, highlighting both human ambition and the limitations of international governance. Memory permeated daily life. Families preserved letters, photographs, and artifacts. Oral histories were passed to subsequent generations. Educational systems reinforced historical understanding. Memorials and museums provided tangible links to the past. These practices ensured that the experiences of the Great War remained central to societal consciousness, shaping how individuals and communities approached questions of governance, diplomacy, and human responsibility. As the decade progressed, society oscillated between recovery and instability. Economies, while growing, were vulnerable to shocks. Political systems faced challenges from both internal dissent and external pressures. Cultural innovation thrived, yet was often infused with the shadow of recent trauma. People navigated a world where the promise of progress coexisted with the lingering potential for conflict. Nature itself bore witness to the war and its aftermath. Fields once torn by artillery slowly returned to fertility. Rivers cleared, forests regrew, and wildlife returned to previously devastated regions. The landscape, resilient and patient, provided continuity and perspective, a living reminder of both destruction and renewal. Through all these changes, the story of how one assassination sparked a world war remained central. People pondered the fragility of peace, the consequences of alliances and pride, and the human capacity for both destruction and resilience. These reflections influenced political decision-making, social norms, education, and cultural expression, forming a collective understanding that would guide generations. Even as the world moved forward, the shadow of the Great War persisted. Veterans' families and communities carried memories, artifacts, and stories that shaped identity and perspective. Governments and societies learned the complexities of international relations, the consequences of economic and political decisions, and the fragile balance between cooperation and conflict. And through it all, life continued. Streets filled with children's laughter, markets buzzed with trade, fields bore crops, and the rhythms of daily existence resumed. The memory of war remained, guiding decisions and shaping values, but the persistence of humanity, its creativity, resilience, and capacity for renewal, shone as a testament to endurance after catastrophe. The decade that followed the Great War gradually gave way to a new, cautious optimism. Across Europe, people had rebuilt what they could, and in doing so, discovered the limits and strengths of human resilience. Cities, once bombed into fragments, now hummed with the tentative rhythm of daily life. Trains carried passengers across repaired tracks, factories produced goods once again, and markets filled with fresh produce. Yet even amid this apparent normality, the scars of the war, both physical and emotional, remained ever present, quietly shaping behavior, attitudes, and social structures. In France, recovery took on a deeply human dimension. Children born during or just after the war grew up learning stories of both courage and sorrow. Families who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons found ways to commemorate them while nurturing the living. Schools incorporated lessons not only in literacy and mathematics, but in remembrance and ethics. Communities maintained rituals that connected the past with the present. Annual ceremonies, memorial services, and the careful upkeep of cemeteries and monuments. Each act of remembrance was an acknowledgement that the past, however painful, formed the foundation for the moral and social life of the nation. Belgium, having endured occupation and extensive battles on its soil, faced a similarly layered recovery. Cities and villages were reconstructed, often with the help of international aid. Agriculture, once devastated, returned to productivity as fields were cleared of debris and mines. Villagers who had experienced the worst of war worked collectively to restore their communities. Cooperation and solidarity became not only practical necessities, but sources of pride and resilience. In quiet moments, people would reflect on how a single spark, the assassination in Sarajevo, had rippled outward, consuming nations and shaping the contours of their daily lives in ways that were still being understood. Germany's experience in the post-war era was dominated by economic volatility and political instability. Hyperinflation had erased wealth, social hierarchies were challenged, and political extremism gained traction. Many citizens, though exhausted by hardship, engaged in vigorous debate about the future of their nation. Intellectuals, artists, and politicians alike pondered how Germany could rebuild both materially and morally. Cultural life flourished even amid instability. Literature, theatre, and visual arts explored themes of loss, recovery, and identity, often blending despair with hope, creating a reflective mirror of society's attempts to understand itself after unprecedented upheaval. Britain's society was also adjusting. The country had won the war, but victory carried its own burdens: the loss of nearly 1 million soldiers, the economic costs of prolonged mobilization, and the challenge of reintegrating returning veterans into civilian life. Women, who had demonstrated their capabilities in factories, farms, and offices during wartime, pressed for continued recognition in the workforce and public life. Social reforms, though gradual, were influenced by these changes. Education and healthcare systems expanded to meet the needs of a population marked by grief and change. Communities developed support networks, connecting families, veterans, and the local economy in ways that allowed daily life to move forward with cautious hope. In the United States, the post-war period reflected both prosperity and reflection. American soldiers returned to a country untouched by the physical devastation of European battlefields, yet profoundly aware of its emerging global role. Debates over isolationism versus international engagement shaped political discourse, while economic growth fueled industrial expansion and urbanization. Socially, the war had accelerated movements for equality, particularly for women and minority groups who had contributed significantly during the conflict. Cultural life flourished. Literature, music, and visual arts explored themes of modernity, change, and human resilience, drawing inspiration from both triumph and trauma. Eastern Europe remained a patchwork of upheaval and adaptation. The collapse of the Russian Empire and the revolution that followed had created new political boundaries and ideologies. Civil conflict, famine, and displacement shaped daily life. Societies struggled to define identity and governance amidst uncertainty, while revolutionary ideas inspired hope for some and fear for others. Borders drawn on maps often failed to reflect the lived realities of ethnic and cultural communities, setting the stage for complex social and political dynamics that would unfold over decades. The Middle East, too, was undergoing profound transformation. The Ottoman Empire's collapse had created new geopolitical realities. Territories were placed under foreign mandates, local governance was reshaped, and long-standing cultural and religious dynamics were affected by the imposition of borders and foreign authority. Communities worked to assert their own identities while negotiating relationships with foreign powers. The aftermath of war revealed the deep interconnection between local aspirations and global political strategies, highlighting the ongoing influence of decisions made far from the region itself. Culturally, the post-war world was marked by a mixture of reflection and innovation. Literature grappled with the scale of human suffering, the nature of heroism, and the moral implications of conflict. Poets, novelists, and essayists explored the tension between memory and renewal, between despair and hope. Art movements such as surrealism and expressionism captured emotional truths that conventional representation could not. Music blended traditional forms with new rhythms and harmonies, providing both a vehicle for mourning and an outlet for joy. In every medium, human creativity sought to reconcile the enormity of loss with the desire to continue, to build, and to imagine a world beyond war. Education became a vital part of the post-war social fabric. Schools and universities incorporated histories of the war into curricula, emphasizing not only events but lessons about ethics, diplomacy, and civic responsibility. Students learned to understand the fragility of peace, the consequences of national pride unchecked by prudence, and the importance of international cooperation. These lessons were designed to prepare a generation for participation in a global society aware of the risks inherent in political ambition and human error. Memorialization persisted as both a cultural and moral imperative. Cemeteries, monuments, and museums ensured that the sacrifices of soldiers and civilians were not forgotten. Public ceremonies reinforced a collective memory of loss and endurance. Artifacts, letters, and photographs preserved personal histories, connecting the human experience to broader narratives of nations and ideologies. This ongoing engagement with memory allowed societies to honor the past while using its lessons to guide contemporary decision-making. Technological advancements, accelerated by the pressures of wartime necessity, found new applications in civilian life. Medical techniques developed in field hospitals improved healthcare systems. Engineering innovations facilitated reconstruction of bridges, roads, and urban infrastructure. Communication technologies, including radio and telephone networks, enhanced both governance and commerce. These innovations demonstrated humanity's capacity to transform instruments of destruction into tools for progress, underscoring a paradoxical resilience. The same ingenuity that had fueled devastation now underpinned recovery and modernization. Economically, nations experienced uneven progress. Industrialized countries adapted more quickly, leveraging resources and infrastructure to drive recovery. Agricultural regions required careful restoration after years of neglect and destruction. Urban centers faced housing shortages, employment challenges, and pressure on public services. Governments implemented policies to stabilize economies, support social welfare, and encourage industrial and agricultural growth. This careful balancing of priorities aimed to ensure not just material recovery but social cohesion, recognizing that peace depended on both economic and political stability. Socially, the legacies of the war remained tangible. Veterans returned with both visible injuries and invisible trauma, requiring social and medical support. Families adapted to altered dynamics, particularly as women and younger generations assumed new responsibilities in workplaces, communities, and civic life. Community organizations, often local and grassroots in nature, provided networks of mutual aid, fostering resilience and collective responsibility. These efforts reflected the deep understanding that recovery was not solely the task of governments, but depended on shared commitment across society. Politically, the post-war landscape was delicate and complex. Nations sought to balance internal stability with international obligations. Political extremism, fueled by economic hardship and national humiliation, gained traction in several countries. Diplomatic efforts, embodied in institutions such as the League of Nations, attempted to enforce treaties, mediate disputes, and promote cooperation. Yet these initiatives often encountered limitations. Not every nation participated fully, and enforcement mechanisms were weak. Still, the very existence of such institutions represented a remarkable evolution in global governance, reflecting the awareness that collective dialogue might prevent the repetition of global catastrophe. Memory remained central to the cultural consciousness. Families preserved letters, photographs, and personal objects. Oral histories passed experiences from one generation to the next. Schools, museums, and public spaces reinforced collective awareness. Through these acts, society acknowledged the cost of conflict while embedding its lessons into everyday life. These practices ensured that even as reconstruction advanced, the human dimension of war, the suffering, sacrifice, and endurance, remained vividly present in social and moral consciousness. The natural world, too, slowly recovered. Fields scarred by artillery craters returned to fertility. Rivers cleared, forests regrew, and wildlife returned to habitats once disrupted by human conflict. This slow restoration of nature provided a sense of continuity and perspective. It reminded people that, despite the depth of human suffering, life could regenerate, and with patience, new growth could emerge from devastation. Through all these processes, the narrative of how a single assassination triggered a global conflict persisted, Citizens reflected on the fragility of political systems, the consequences of unchecked ambition, and the unpredictable ways in which individual actions could ripple through history. These lessons informed political decisions, social norms, cultural expressions, and educational practices, shaping societies in ways both subtle and profound. Daily life gradually resumed its rhythms. Streets echoed with children's laughter, markets flourished with activity, and families celebrated milestones once interrupted by the war. The shadows of loss lingered, yet humanity persisted, building, creating, and imagining a future that, while always conscious of its past, sought to reclaim joy, purpose, and connection. This period, often called the interwar years, was marked by both hope and apprehension. Societies recovered and evolved, yet the memories and consequences of the Great War remained vivid, influencing every aspect of life. The lessons learned were imperfectly applied, yet they laid the groundwork for thinking about peace, governance, and human responsibility in a modern, interconnected world. As the interwar years progressed, the world remained caught between remembrance and renewal, between caution and the natural drive to look forward. Nations, communities, and individuals had been irrevocably changed by the events set into motion in Sarajevo, yet life persisted with a steady rhythm. Streets and fields that had once been battle-scarred gradually regained their vitality. Markets, workshops, and classrooms filled with activity, while families nurtured children who were too young to remember the war, but were nevertheless shaped by its legacies. Society's collective memory remained alive, a quiet but persistent reminder that even small actions, decisions made in the corridors of power, an assassination in a distant city, could cascade into consequences that reshaped the entire world. Politically, the interwar period was a delicate balance of diplomacy and tension. Governments sought to enforce treaties, stabilize economies, and rebuild institutions. The League of Nations offered a forum for dialogue, though its authority was limited and unevenly respected. Extremist movements arose in multiple nations, fueled by economic hardship, national humiliation, and the lingering traumas of war. Leaders and citizens alike became increasingly aware of the precariousness of peace, understanding that the choices of individuals and nations could either maintain harmony or ignite new conflicts. Economically, the recovery was uneven. Industrialized regions rebuilt more quickly, taking advantage of wartime technological innovations that could now serve peaceful purposes. Agricultural areas, once devastated by artillery, chemical contamination, and neglect, were gradually restored. Urban centers faced challenges, housing shortages, strained public services, and the task of reintegrating veterans and displaced populations. Governments responded with social programs, infrastructure projects, and policies aimed at stabilizing society. The lesson was clear: sustainable peace required both material stability and social cohesion. Culturally, societies processed trauma and renewal through literature, art, music, and theater. Writers explored grief, disillusionment, and the search for meaning. Artists experimented with form, abstraction, and surrealism, capturing the emotional complexity of a post-war world. Music provided solace, reflection, and joy. In these creative expressions, communities found both catharsis and connection, reinforcing resilience while acknowledging the deep scars left by conflict. On a human scale, memory shaped daily life. Veterans shared their experiences with families, schools incorporated histories of the war, and communities maintained monuments and memorials. Letters, photographs, and personal artifacts were preserved, connecting generations and offering tangible evidence of lives touched by global events. Through these practices, societies ensured that the lessons of the past, both its horrors and its acts of resilience, remained central to identity, ethics, and governance. In the natural world, restoration mirrored human efforts. Forests regenerated, rivers cleared, and farmland returned to productivity. Wildlife returned to areas once disrupted by human conflict. The slow but steady recovery of nature provided a living metaphor for societal healing. Persistence, patience, and adaptation could gradually restore vitality after even the most devastating disruption. Now, reflecting on the central question of this narrative, how one assassination sparked a world war, the answer becomes clear through the interconnected threads of history. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the spark, but the tinder had been accumulating for decades. Political alliances, nationalist tensions, military build-ups, and a fragile balance of power created a situation where a single act could escalate uncontrollably. The assassination itself did not create the war, but it set in motion a series of decisions, alliances, and reactions that ultimately engulfed Europe and spread across the globe. This chain of events reminds us of the delicate and often unpredictable nature of human history. Small actions can have consequences far beyond what anyone could foresee. Ultimately, the First World War was not just a story of battles and politics. It was a story of human resilience, adaptation, and reflection. Societies learned to rebuild, to honor memory, and to pursue progress even amid lingering shadows. Communities found ways to survive, families preserved the legacies of loved ones, and nations experimented with mechanisms for peace. While the scars remained, life continued, shaped and informed by the lessons of the past. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this calm history narrative. I hope this story helped you understand how one assassination could ripple through time and change the course of the world. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories like this one. Wishing you a peaceful night and calm dreams filled with history, reflection, and quiet curiosity.